Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host Rich Gear here as well, and we have a returning guest here. Mike, how you doing?
Doing great tonight, thank you.
This is Mike Nolan.
Mike Nolan, yes.
Dr. Mike Nolan, he's a chemistry guy, and he is also a...
He has web design. He's doing web design right now, right?
Yeah, websites, web applications.
Talk a little bit about how you went from a chemistry guy to a web guy.
Yeah.
How did that happen again?
So long and short of it is, I had too much fun writing software for my lab.
So you do what you really want to do.
And then I found out I like doing this, and I can get paid doing it, so now I'm doing it for professionally, so.
Seriumsoft.com.
Yes, that's the one.
And so we're talking tonight a little bit about a book that he's recommending called The Twilight of Atheism. And who is the author of this book?
So it's Alistair McGrath. So he is, I think himself, he was a convert from atheism, and then also he has written numerous books on various religious topics, on history. And yeah, this book was the first of his that I read and is quite interesting.
Is it as difficult to be an atheist as when I went to college? Because I frankly couldn't find enough faith to become an atheist when I was in college. And that's one of the things that I remember Dr. Dwayne Gish saying one time, you wouldn't believe what an unbeliever has to believe in order to be an unbeliever.
I was going to say, I told you about last time about how I met God in quantum chemistry class. What's funny is shortly after that incident, I think we were actually on a picture on collegehumor.com, which shows this like evangelist table over here and the campus atheists doing their event, and both of our tables got put next to each other. And
Oh, interesting.
so if you see that picture floating around on the internet, I think there is a version that either has me or someone in our particular group in it. That was Georgia Tech's Fellowship of Christian Students, also called the Lasagna Club, for those who were there back in the day, because of a very particular outreach by the leader of that group at the time. And I was going to say, we did have some interesting dialogues with that group, and strangely enough, I actually mentored a number of people from the campus atheists because they were also chemi majors.
Wow.
Okay, all right.
So that led to some kind of interesting relationships and even long-term friendships. And when you mention it, Doug, I do remember one particular conversation I had with one of those guys. We're out to dinner together, and I remember it was just kind of strange because the whole time I was talking about science and he was talking about moral issues. And I just remember I kind of stopped this on, man, it's almost like we're both talking the way we expect the other person to talk.
You know, that is not uncommon, believe it or not. I know one of our good friends, Dr. Jerry Bergman, we mentioned him.
Yeah.
He goes on to a lot of these campus type things. He says, I don't want to talk about religion, I want to talk about the science. And invariably, they will bring up Noah's Ark or Adam and Eve, Cain gets his wife, you name it. Doug and I ran into the same thing I remember we came down, years ago to that, where was that school, Plymouth?
Yeah, it was in Canton.
It was at Canton, it was a high school, and they wanted to have a debate, and Doug and I, we're not debating, that's not our forte for the most part. We don't like presenting something like that, but we said, all right, we'll do it, and we come down there, and all the science professors kind of backed out of it, and then and all they wanted to do was talk about biblical issues, and why this couldn't be true, and this was all this, and then somebody finally said, well, wait, I thought we were going to have a debate here, and finally I said, well, we were going to have one, but all your teachers decided not to show up. I mean, they basically backed out of it. So we got an open forum to say what we want to say. So it wasn't we were here and they weren't. So anyway,
Sure.
But that happens a lot. It's not unusual that you would be the Christian guy would be talking about the science, and then the science guy is trying to argue and hammer you on religious things.
Yeah.
It happens very, very often,
Yeah, and the funny thing is, it wasn't particularly confrontational. We were just talking about life, but it was interesting, the expectations we both had of each other versus the reality, and it's one of a number of interesting realizations. And then kind of same thing getting into the book we'll talk about. That now the book itself, The Twilight of Atheism, what the author does is he looks at it not only as just kind of like a couple topical issues like theory of evolution or something like that, but instead he looks at it as there was actually this larger social cultural movement, and he kind of bookends it from starting at the French Revolution and ending at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he talks about, if you look at it as a particular kind of movement that had a particular view of the world, and further that it's distinct from other seemingly similar movements, you do see that there is this particular about 200-year trend that rises up during the 19th century, peaks in the mid-20th, and finally starts to come to an end and decline towards the beginning of the 21st century. And what this means is not only the rise and fall of a particular movement, but also what it means is for us too to look forward to even the nature of the debate, I think, will change in the years ahead as different movements come and take its place.
So you really observe a lot of different things coming up and to take the place of atheism. We see postmodernism, we see other New Age philosophies,
Yes.
a lot of Mother Earth stuff, save the whales, a lot of cults, things of that sort. And so the debate then changes from atheism because a lot of people realize atheism is bankrupt. And so you have a different, a whole different paradigm to deal with when you're doing apologetics. So you have to not only be able to understand atheism, but you have to understand all sorts of different false doctrines.
So you're dealing with this book deals with the twilight of atheism, but that doesn't mean the Christians are off the hook, because what you're just saying, other things are going to come in to replace it. What is it? Just mainly people began to realize how irrational atheism was, or what is this? What's the premise of the book? I guess in a thumbnail, and it's kind of got. Obviously, when you deal with books like this, there's a lot of intricacies involved in it. You talk about. I'm very aware of some of the socioeconomic things that were leading up to some of this stuff. There was a lot of Malthusian. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that was going on there. The idea of the classical biblical model of looking at things. People were really, I think, just trying to reject it. They were trying to get away from it, okay? And what's interesting to me, and I brought this up in the last show, I think, if I did, you can stop me, whatever, but it's the idea that they wanted to throw out the rule maker, that is, there is no God, but they wanted to hold on to a lot of the rules. I find it very ironic, oftentimes, that atheists, or if you will, evolutionists, they start accusing us creationists of lying. And I go, well, so what? We're not. But the point of it is, they love to use our worldview against us to promote their own ascendancy, okay? But the reality is lying has no value whatsoever in an atheistic world system. And that's, I think, is that what's going on here? That the idea, realize people said, no, we have to have values. We can't live without. There has to be something that's true. There has to be something that's falce. And even if it's only my perception of truth, that's what really is truth. I'm just wanting you to kind of delve into some of those kinds of things, if you would.
Sure. And actually, I would suggest approaching it from a little bit different viewpoint. So I guess I can kind of like look at where the book begins and talk about the growth and some of the issues. So yeah, I think the first thing to understand is kind of the beginning of the movement in its context in history, because one thing that is often not taught in schools now, and I'm just now starting to read it myself, is what really happened during the medieval period. Normally you get a lot of mythology around it, but really one of the things that happened from the Dark Ages up through the medieval period is that there initially was not a very trying to think how to say it. There was no single authority, right? The church had some authority. The kings had some, although they were much less powerful initially. You also had like local organizations, the guilds, the boroughs. When people talked about the family, it was not just what we would now call the nuclear family, but it was like you would have an extended family almost seeing themselves as their own little clan or tribe.
Oh, yeah.
And so what happened was you had all these different power centers. And what happened was Christianity during that period of time was kind of a sort of guiding order to help people arrange and understand what to do during it all. And what's interesting about that is when it also comes to the relationship of church and state at that point, yes, the church would like go and bless the king, but if that king was not a good king, like they still had some ability to say, hey, like this guy's not that good, right? And even then, the church's authority was not total during that time either. What happened in the lead up to the French Revolution in the couple centuries prior, you started to instead have the kings begin to assert more authority. I know in the 1300s there were movements in England to start seizing some of the monasteries, right, some of the church lands. You also had, during the Protestant Reformation, you had the formation of state churches. So, for example, the Church of England is one.
Sure.
And what's interesting is during this period of time, actually the church and state start coming together. And they start being one thing. And in some ways, the church became just as much of a political institution as the monarchy was.
Right.
And so what happened over in Europe is that if you wanted to criticize the king because you started to see different political changes happening at this time, that also meant necessarily you were also criticizing the church, which in some cases, like in the Church of England, is one and the same.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is if you look at the religious history and you look at how like Christianity actually grew and thrived for a long time in the United States, one of the reasons for that, funny enough, was the separation of church and state, because what happened is if the state is doing something wrong, right, that is not the church's fault. So if you're criticizing one, it's not necessarily criticizing the other. And in fact, you could have a sense of community in one without having to be totally given to the other.
Yeah, they were separate provinces. They just, and we even have that kind of thing even today, where they realize this, and that's, of course, that's the thing that really is troublesome today in today's world, where as a believer, that separation of church and state only goes one way. Okay, in other words, if the state does not like what the church is doing, they're going to come right in on you. But the church has no say in the state at all. Okay?
Exactly. Our understanding of it has changed because I believe when Thomas Jefferson was first writing about that, it was more as a way of protecting the church, which turned out to be true if you look at this historically.
Yeah.
Now, so what then happened is when you started seeing the lead up to the French Revolution, you started to get these critics who were saying, well, you know, the church has become corrupted, and they started saying we have to find the real religion. And you saw this by some of the French philosophers of the time. They were writing about this first. And then this eventually came to the idea instead of, well, maybe religion is just something we've made up ourselves. So their thought was if we could set ourselves free, we could somehow find like the true good or the true faith, or like being set free, like we will become, right, truly unlimited. And then this is also around the time you start to get into the early to mid 1800s, you start to get people like Karl Marx who have like a completely utopian vision of this. He's like, oh, like with science we can deterministically know what is the ideal society, who are the ideal people, right? We can create this perfect world, and in that sense he just starts to say, oh, well, religion's just standing between us and that. So this is kind of when a particular form of atheism, modernism, really started to take off. People put a lot of hope in it. They thought there was going to be a very bright future. You would go on to see movements such as the Fabian Socialists, for example, again, trying to say we will create this ideal society on Earth. And as you know, this leads us up into the early 1900s and World War I and World War II, as well as the Cold War and the communist period following after.
Well, you said talk about Marx, okay, but you had Lyell, geology, and Hutton before him, right, Doug? You know, cut us loose from the geological the biblical framework of the Earth. Okay, in other words, according to biblical time things, Earth is very young. Okay, but from Lyell and Hutton before him, the geology. Then you had, of course, the Darwinian thing, but you had many things beginning to cut us loose. What always disturbs me, though, is how often the church becomes almost its own worst enemy. And Doug, you brought into some of the book even early on how the church subscribed to many older theories very early on, and almost theistic evolutionist type.
Yeah, let's just incorporate all this stuff into the
incorporate into the Bible.
Science is the 67th chapter of the Bible, so we can just take what we learned through science and add to what the Bible has to say.
In other words, what you're saying didn't happen in a vacuum. There were several things, seemed to me, that helped cut us loose from the biblical model, which had been, at least in Europe, and even in the United States, of course, for 1,000, 2,000 years, a long time, it had been the paradigm. Okay, this was a huge paradigm shift happening to go from classical thinking, if you will, to modernism, okay?
Right.
And that's when atheism began to come in, when they start cutting us loose from theological realities, and science was used to do that because it dealt with the material, not some ethereal thing. And of course, we talked about that before. Thomas Aquinas and people like that cut us loose in the sense they made an upper story reality and a lower story. Lower story was the earth. And when they started to be preoccupied only with the earth, the Renaissance came into some of that stuff too.
Right.
Basically, all these things over the centuries served to cut us loose, which allowed for this kind of philosophical change to occur.
Yes.
And you say, and I agree with you, but it was about a 200 or at least 150 year period of time where it really was the predominant paradigm. It really, the late 1700s is when it started cutting loose. And then when the science and the philosophers and things began to go up into it sort of codified, it made it legitimate to not be a believer. Okay?
But there was also some things going on at that same time where we were actually having some real revivals. You know, the Wesleys and the Whitfield and Charles Finney and those folks.
Of course, it's not. Yeah, you are absolutely right, Doug. But that's as a believer, we don't ever believe the Lord's going to just cut you loose. He's going to put in a standard and protect and put a wall, if you will, for you to not only survive but even thrive. Bible societies got huge during this particular period of time. So there was a really counter move, if you will, and it's just the way it is. You see the theistic worldview, and even today with our irrational approach to everything, people are they're retreating back to many times to the classical viewpoint, and because they still want rules. Human beings were not designed to live without rules. And postmodernism virtually throws them off. It really tells you there is no rules. It's acknowledging the truth that there is no God, there are no rules. If there is no, and so, but then people...
I think one of the expressions is that that something is true to the extent that there is power behind it.
And that's diabolical, but that is exactly what's going on. So, okay, continue your thesis. Doug and I kind of went into it a little bit, but I just wanted to say there's a lot of ideas that come up, and they don't just happen in a vacuum,
Exactly, and that's exactly how to look at it. That of course you've got so many things happening over this long time period. I mean, there are other books we could go into to say, like, you can even see, like, from 500 years ago, certain trends beginning that slowly bring us into the present. And so what's interesting for this is, again, you have this period, like, coming up to the late 1700s, you have initially the people saying, we got to look for this natural religion. Then they started to say, well, really, religion's just, like, man kind of, like, looking at himself or creating something in the image of himself. And this would then lead to the idea of, like, well, man is the measure of all things, and this very utopian ideal of if we can just set ourselves free, we will create a perfect world on Earth. And in fact, at the peak of it, in the 1960s, if you remember, like, in some of the great works of fiction of that age, you had, was it Star Trek? You had 2001 Space Odyssey.
60s, yeah.
Yeah, and you really had this kind of like looking forward, and I'm thinking of especially Space Odyssey at the end, right, and the formation of the Star Child. Like there's this very just optimistic view of what would come. But the thing is, is, again, we started to see that there were certain societies that tried to build themselves on these principles. You had Nazi Germany with its eugenics idea of like, we're going to breed the perfect human. You had, under the communist system, the idea of we're going to scientifically manage the whole society, and just the incredible amount of murder and starvation that came out of that, along with a couple of other famous incidents where the leaders had no problem using people as guinea pigs in experiments, in various social experiments. And once this information came out, we started to see that, right, maybe this is not as straightforward as we first thought it was. You had that trend. You also had the beginnings of postmodernism, as early as, say, like the critical theories starting from the 1930s, as well as post-World War II with the beginning of postmodernism. Right, you had this approach to it, and the key there is to compare postmodernism to modernism in the context of, say, like atheism and evolution. That in modernism, there's this idea that everything is proceeding through a particular kind of deterministic set of stages to a predictable outcome, right? And so, for example, like, and this is out of Marxism, he'll say, like, you know, out of feudalism, we evolved to capitalism, which was the penultimate stage, and then the ultimate or final stage would be socialism and communism.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it was this idea that time had an arrow, and this was also why, of the evolutionary theories of the 1800s, what made Darwin so popular was it kind of said that, again, species are moving in a particular order, and therefore man is at the top of the chain. And of course, also, too, because of the attitudes of people back then, they also started to say, okay, out of the people, which people are at the top of the chain? And I remember all the way back to like my freshman English class, the guy was showing us a chart of like, in which they were kind of indexing all of these in a tree. And what's funny is like the English put themselves on the top, and what's funny is they put the Irish at the bottom.
Yeah. Well,
And
so
being
much
half
for us.
Irish, like that's kind of, it's just kind of a
Nobody respects the Irish.
shock for that, yeah. But as you can guess, like, yeah, that actually went on to justify a lot of really bad ideas, but also, too, yeah, this idea of linear predictable advancement. There's one illustration I like to use, which is, imagine this for a moment, all right? If you've got me and you've got a jellyfish at this desk, based on evolution, which one's more evolved?
Yeah.
It depends on what medium you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. If we're at this desk, right? It'd be me. You drop us both in the Pacific Ocean, which was more evolved, right? And now what's interesting is there's another book that's, and it's interesting how he brings it in, but it's called Law, Legislation, and Liberty by Friedrich Hayek. Now this was a sociological book.
This is referred to in the Twilight of Atheism book?
No, this is actually another book.
Okay.
And so this author, what's funny is he was not religious himself, but he was complaining about people who started talking about social evolution, that like, oh, people at the top of the hierarchy are more evolved. So in his argument against that, one of the interesting things he points out is that people actually had it backwards. It turned out that Darwin had borrowed from the economic concept of evolution that people, by trading, form societies.
Okay.
Right, by interacting. It's not the other way around, that they started with the evolution of species and then someone tried to derive from that. What he also explains too is that societies do not form by steps. And so when when he was writing this in the mid 20th century, again, you started to see these series of criticisms which have now begun to lead us to a new debate in which people are now starting to understand, like, we cannot build the world ourselves, right? It's not just us ourselves, like, actually spirituality is a component. And what's interesting is I've even seen in some textbooks, this is starting to come back, and the debate now is, what is the nature of that spirituality?
Okay. And what are they saying?
Well, I mean, that is the debate of our time. We have, of course, right, some of the New Age or the postmodern type of things in which, right, we have a very different value system than what a lot of us are familiar with. We also have Christianity growing in places you don't expect it. Like I just think about my involvement in the Chinese community,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah, huge there.
Yeah, and
Africa.
yeah, no, that's
And
true.
some South America, a lot of Christianity. I know people think, well, Catholics have been down for a long, but specifically Protestant Christianity is
Yes.
becoming very huge in South America. So anyway, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So, and so it's one of the interesting things to think about that. Yeah, as we're talking about this, that we're once again living through an interesting part of history in which, again, I think we're going to see the entire debate begin to change once again.
Yeah, we have a sort of like a cancel culture where no matter what you do, you're guilty. You know, you have this sense of that you are responsible for all this mess that is, no matter what it is, the climate change, the COVID-19 thing. This is all because we've mismanaged things, and we are guilty. And they don't have an answer, but they have. They can point
the figures. Yeah, yeah.
I would say almost like a witch hunt.
Yeah.
Modern witch hunt.
Yeah, modern
Yeah.
witch hunt. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you're saying that like atheism is now being eclipsed. It had a 150, 200 year run, and now it's pretty much people realize that's not tenable, and they're going. That's where all this. Now they're getting a lot of things to replace it now, and the debate on spirituality is. But of course, like I say, but Christianity is part of that debate. And of course, it always will be. We believe that will never not be part of the debate. But there's a lot of alternative viewpoints out there, and there has been probably for my whole life. I remember back in the days when Hare Krishnas were on the streets doing stuff. In fact, today in America, 2020 reminds you a lot of like the early 70s, the late 60s, and a lot of occultism, a lot of New Ageism, a lot of weird stuff going on there. And then the Lord did His thing. And,
we only have a minute here, so Mike, tell us a little about your website, economicsofmorality.com.
yeah.
Okay, so the economics of morality is a theory that I'm working on. So I'm kind of an economics enthusiast as a part of my reading, and that's where I get kind of an interesting set of books. And one of the things there is that there's a specific school of economics known as the Austrian School, and specifically by groups like the Mises Institute, MISES. And these guys talk about subjective value or intangible value, and it turns out that you stop looking at economics as the science of money, but actually as the science of choice, how people make choices. And it turns out that there actually are certain moral rules and inferences you can pull out from that. And so I'm starting to develop those ideas at economicsofmorality.com.
Okay, thank you for being on our show tonight, Mike. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.